This is Debbie Georgiani. Thank you for listening to the Station of the Cross, proclaiming the fullness of truth with clarity and charity.
Heard around the world on your Android and Apple mobile devices.
The simple truth, rising up to explore the difficult topics of real life. Join us as we proclaim the good, the true, and the beautiful with the simple truth of Jesus Christ and His Holy Catholic Church through Scripture, tradition, and the Catechism. And now, your host, Jim Havens.
It is great to be back with you on The Simple Truth. We consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong heart of Saint Joseph. Today is Testimony Tuesday, where we bring you real, live, first-hand testimonial accounts of the life-giving reality of Jesus and His Catholic Church. Our guest today is Scott Woltze. He is founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ. He's got quite a story to share, and we're very blessed to have him here with us to share it. Scott Woltze, thank you for being with us. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Yes, thank you for being here with us. And we always begin at the beginning. Let's start with childhood. What was your early life like, your family, the culture that you grew up in?
Well, my first 7 years were as good as any child could hope to have. I lived on the central coast of California, San Luis Obispo area. It was always warm. You had the sun out, the ocean breeze blowing in. It was undeveloped at that time, so lots of grasslands and hills and trees to explore. And my mom was an amazing Catholic woman. I mean, from my birth to her death, she was just someone who always radiated the peace of Christ and the love, especially the last, 10 years of her life. Really, to look into her face, was to see Jesus looking back at you with love. And then my dad, he was an easy guy to idolize, young kids, they want their dad to be their hero, and it was easy for me to look at my dad as a hero because he was really smart. He was good with his hands. Seems like he could do anything. He was very funny, and, he loved us. He gave us lots of attention. He brought us with him to all of his job sites. He was a landscape architect. And, we'd play as he'd, build fountains and decks and irrigation ditches. But, there were some storm clouds on the horizon that I didn't see coming, as a 7-year-old. And that's that he drank a lot. I thought it was normal, We'd hop in the work truck to go to the job site, and there'd be crumpled Anheuser-Busch cans all over the floor, and some would always fall out, and we'd have to, get back out of the truck, put him back on the floor, and hop back in. And he and his coworkers, which were his best friends, they'd drink like a can of beer apiece every hour. They just kind of keep the party going throughout the day. And so the work site would be just strewn with beer cans. My brother and I were playing with our little green army men in the irrigation ditches that they built. And there's like you're trying to make it realistic, the Nazis against the Allies, but you got this like beer can sitting there, so something had to give. You can't go through life eating, drinking half a case of beer a day. And so my dad decided that he had to leave because he knew he couldn't get out of that lifestyle if he stayed there with his friends. And so we decided to move up to Portland, and he was going to enroll in college, and he would, later become a software engineer in the early 80s, computer programmer. But before we left, something happened that was really a shock to all of us, and just kind of was a herald of things to come. So basically, my older brother and I, we were playing outside my mom's door because she was a nurse who worked the graveyard shift, and we missed her. And so, we're playing outside her door with our little cars, bumping the door gently. And my dad said several times, he's like, hey, she's trying to sleep, get away from the door. And we'd leave, and then we'd kind of drift back. How little kids are. They just feel that it's like there's a gravitational pull, to their mom. And we went back one more time to the door, and my dad just flipped. He screamed in rage, something I'd never heard, and came running, and then pivoted he realized he couldn't hit us because we're like 7 or whatever. And he pivoted and he just plants his fist in the wall. And he's a big guy. His fist goes right through the wall. My mom, like, flings open the door and is like, just in complete shock, And she's like, "What are you doing?" And, my mom, she had never seen that side of my dad. They barely knew each other before they got married. He was in the service. And they just kind of wrote letters back and forth. And they really came from diametrically opposed families in every way imaginable, not just like culturally and socially, but really in the spiritual realm. St. Augustine has this famous distinction between the city of God in the city of man, right? The city of God is the city of heaven. It's the city where people love, so much that they love even to contempt of their own self. They love God and their neighbor that much. And then the other city is the city of man. Now, I know it doesn't sound that bad, but it's really the city of hell, right? It's love of self, even to the contempt of God, even to the contempt of other people. And similarly, St. Ignatius of Loyola makes a similar distinction between like the two opposing armies, and they each got their standard, their battle flag. You got the standard of Jesus and the standard of Satan. And, as much as you can instantiate, a concept in the real world, make it really concrete, as Pope Benedict used to say, I'll be darned, but my mom's family really did, was a concrete example of the city of God on earth. They weren't perfect, obviously. And then my dad's family really was. It's just so sad for him and his parents, and was really kind of the city of hell. And so, so my mom grew up in this very tight-knit Dutch dairy farming family. They're all Catholic. They're all fairly recent immigrants. They all still speak Dutch. They sent their kids to Catholic school. They've got vocations in the family. My great-aunt, Sister Angelica, was an amazing Dominican who kept the faith. Even when many of her sisters had gotten rid of the habit and kind of dabbled in New Age and feminism, she still was like right before she died, she re-signed and her original vows, and she emphasized all of the points. It was very sort of Council of Trent, the vows, but I mean, it was beautiful. I mean, because she had so much love. My great aunt, Sister Angelica. It's just, she was an amazing person, and she certainly helped keep that respect of religion, of Christianity and Catholicism alive in me after I wandered very far away. And then conversely, my dad's family, they were kind of well off, not rich, but kind of upper middle class. They had a swimming pool in the backyard, San Fernando Valley down in LA. My poor dad was abandoned, by his real father when he was around 3 or so, and never saw him again, in fact. And so his mother, who was kind of this movie star, she wasn't a movie star. She looked like one, though. She was just drop dead gorgeous, 6-foot blonde. And she reeled in this 6'6" German guy, this big giant herking guy, but who was actually an intellectual and worked at the Defense Department, reviewing contracts and stuff. But he had no faith. He was interested in like German philosophy, and he would sit and read it all day. And he did not want children, and really resented my dad and my brother. And really my dad experienced no love at all from his mother or his stepfather as a child. And in fact, experienced a lot of violence and cruelty and whatnot. So, all my dad got for 10 years, and today's his birthday, by the way, all he got for 10 years was just pain, at home. So anyway, so he brought all that pain with him into the marriage, and he was covering it, with the Budweiser. And, like I said, that can't continue. He'd blacked out a few times, not at work, of course, but after partying with the buddies. And so we moved up to Portland. And, it was terrible. The 80s had record rain, and my dad just got worse and worse, and there wasn't much my mom could do about it. My dad had such a strong personality, and my mom was just this, loving, patient, dairy girl, So, my older brother and I, we tried to, when you're in an abusive relationship, what you try to do is placate the other person, try to keep these outbursts at a minimum. He was blown up about once a week. And so, we'd try our best in school and we tried to overachieve, because that's what he was interested in. So I was like first year trumpet every year and would win some awards. And then my brother was like one of the youngest Eagle Scouts in Oregon history. He was like an Eagle Scout by the age of 13. And similarly, I had this sash of, endless merit badges. But, and I will say, fortunately, my dad did not want to be like his stepfather, right? And so fortunately, he didn't bring that level of violence and cruelty. I mean, it was bad, but glory be to God that he, So.
All right, Scott Woltze is with us. He's founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ. He's going to be back with us when we come back and share more from there on his story. All by God's grace, all for God's glory. We're kind of in in this portion here of, you can, sense these warring influences in the life of Scott as he's a young person. And maybe good to reflect on as we head into the break, those warring influences in your own life as you were a young person, and how would that have affected you? How did that affect your perception of things, the formation of your heart and mind, your will, the actions that you took from there? Maybe we can just entrust it all to God once more as we try to understand it more. We'll be back with Scott. Stay tuned.
So the average person actually uses this phone for at least 3 hours and 15 minutes. If we just dedicate some time to praying the rosary, we will eliminate all those things that constantly distract us and waste our time. We actually replace it with something constructive and holy, praying the rosary.
That's Sermons for Everyday Living, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern on the Station of the Cross.
Howdy, this is Adrian Fonseca, producer of the Catholic Drive Time Morning Show on the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network each weekday morning at 7 a.m. We strive to keep you informed and inspired with insightful guests and a look at the breaking news of the day that you need to know. Join us on the Catholic Drive Time Show every weekday morning at 7 a.m. across the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio app. That's every weekday morning at 7 a.m. I look forward to seeing you there. God love you.
As a nonprofit lay organization financially independent from your diocese, our apostolate is listener-supported. Through your generosity, we are able to inspire countless listeners with the gospel message and help lead them to a parish to be spiritually nourished by the sacraments. The Station of the Cross thanks our supporters who have enabled us to broadcast Catholic programs for more than 20 years. Thank you for your continued support, and may God bless you and your family.
What you're offering and giving to me, you deserve to get back, because you're offering more than I can give.
I learned so much through the Station on the Cross. I listen to the radio station daily, and I absolutely love it.
I was attending the chapel and places like that, and through your programs, I was able to find out how other Protestants had come back into the Catholic Church. God bless the Station of the Cross.
Donate today at thestationofthecross.com.
Simple Truth. Jim Havens here on this Testimony Tuesday with our guest Scott Woltze. He is founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ. It's an apostolate of Catholics who bring the presence of Jesus to the streets with chapters in Portland, Oregon, Louisville, Kentucky, and the Philippines. You can learn more by going to urbanapostolate.blogspot.com. We're blessed to have Scott here with us today, sharing some of his personal testimony. And so, Scott, as we go forward, we always want to try to follow the grace, especially the sacramental graces. So, got to ask, were you baptized as an infant? Were you confirmed as a young person? And then kind of just maybe lead us through the high school years and connecting us into the young adult years.
Yeah, so, I was blessed to be baptized a Catholic. I went to the first 2 years while I lived in California. I went to St. Patrick's Catholic school in Arroyo Grande, and I loved it. I loved the two sisters that were there. And it's hard to believe when you realize that I end up in prison for robbing banks at the age of 18. But when I was, 8 and 9 and 10 even, I used to stay up late. I had my kids' Bible, but it was the nice thick one, right? It wasn't, they didn't take all the good stuff out of it. It was the real Bible, all the books, but just kind of simplified a little bit. And I'd stay up to 1 a.m, hiding my reading lamp, with the blanket over it so my parents didn't know. And I'd be reading about Samson and the Acts of the Apostles, just whatever. And I love the life of the saints. I was born on St. Dominic's feast day. As I said, my great aunt, who I was very close to, was a Dominican nun. And so I loved Francis. I loved all the friars, So I was given this gift early on of faith. And I did wonder if I should be a priest. My great aunt would ask me, in her little Dutch accent, so Scott, do you think you would like to be a priest one day? Anyway, so yeah, I was definitely blessed, but I started skipping mass, as I became a teenager. There wasn't a lot going on at mass, unfortunately. In the 70s and 80s, there wasn't much catechesis. There was kind of like the priest would dodge the difficult kind of interesting stuff in the homily. So, you'd hear the gospel reading and the other readings as a 10, 12-year-old, and you're like, oh, this is gonna be good. There's some crazy stuff happening. Jesus is saying some crazy stuff. And then the priest gets up there and he's like, buy less stuff at the mall, be nice, stuff like that. And it's like, what? I mean, sure, okay, but how about the rest of this stuff? And, I was suffering a lot at home. And there was nothing in the mass, in the homilies, in the music, in just sort of the culture of that community that had an answer or had anything. It was a very sort of middle class, kind of comfortable gospel. And I was starving, man. I was in pain. I needed God bad. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll mention it since we're at that time of the life. I actually turned my back on God explicitly when I was about 13. I got chased out of the house again by my dad. I got no shoes on. I'm like shorts, t-shirts, like cold outside, cold and rainy. And I run out the house and I stop in front of this giant Douglas fir tree. And I talked to the tree like it was God. I think I'd always kind of fixated on that tree because it reminded me of like the majesty and grandeur of God, the strength of God. And I told him I was crying and I said, where have you been? I mean, this has been going on for like 5 years, 6 years. I mean, what's going on, man? And I just felt abandoned. I felt that God abandoned me. And so I just said, I never want to hear from you again. I never want to talk to you again. I'm out of here. And so, I mean, honestly, from that point, I started shoplifting. I was shoplifting comic books, Lego sets, just anything that wasn't nailed down. And as my teenage years progressed, I just, was escalating these thefts, and I was running around vandalizing stuff just for the heck of it. And it's like, it's like I was dead inside. Right. The pain that I'd experienced, there was just so much anxiety. And so I would do these crazy things to get this little charge of adrenaline. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And of course, what happens is the more you do this stuff, you're victimizing other people, right? By throwing eggs at their house or, stealing stuff. And so you end up being more alienated, more miserable, feeling more dead inside, because that's what sin does, right? Jesus is the life. Well, guess what? Sin is the death. And, you know, there was just something about me at that time where, you know, there's this phrase in Isaiah about the crooked timber of our humanity, and a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin took it up later and talked about it a lot. And I always love that phrase because, boy, was my timber crooked. And you know what? It was like the devil, like he'd propose these things to me, kind of like the apple in the garden. He'd say, like, you know, I wouldn't hear him, but, you know, these little temptations like, Scott, why don't you do this? And I'll be darned, you know, one time after another, you know, I would always bite the apple. You know, there's a thing, the phrase, the mystery of iniquity. It was like a siren call, man. And I made the wrong choice over and over and over, you know? So I was just pile driving myself deeper and deeper, you know, into the kingdom of sin, basically. And, you know, and I had buddies who were basically petty hoods, and we were all petty hoods, you know, running around. You know, we'd have cars. We'd steal car parts for the cars. Then we graduated to stealing cars, right? And eventually, you know, I left all that, the petty crime behind, and I decided to start robbing banks. And now my buddies, I didn't tell them because I knew they wouldn't do it, because there's a huge difference. Like, it's hard to rob a bank. Not like it's not that the mechanics are difficult. What's hard is getting over the hump, right? Getting yourself to do it. Like serious crime, it's like your guardian angel and your conscience, God's grace, all these things are throwing blocks in front of you saying, don't do it. Don't do it. You don't want to go here. And so you really have to fight like a dog to get over that hump, to get through that and actually do a serious crime. And so I'll just say, people who end up in prison, you know, they deserve it because they worked hard to commit that crime. So that's just, you know, from my experience. But, and, you know, part of me wanted to go to prison. You know, I know it sounds crazy, but, I was dead. You know, I was just completely broken. And, you know, I'd even started heating up like knives on a stove and stuff. Like, I felt so dead that, like, you know, I saw this movie called A Man Called Horse, where these Native Americans do these like coming of age rituals. And so I'm like, oh, I'm going to do that. You know, so I heat up the knife on a stove and I put it here and I put it there. And I mean, I was just doing everything to feel something, you know, because I was so alienated, you know, from God and other people and myself. So, you know, so I took the plunge. You know, I robbed 3 banks over the course of 2 months. And, you know, at first it was incredibly exhilarating, and it was exactly what I was looking for. And it was fun to have the money. It was fun to like drive up to Vancouver, BC, where the drinking age is 19. And, you know, I looked 21, so no one ever carded me. You know, it's fun. But that's how Satan works, right? He's like, hey, let's do this. It's fun. And it is for a bit. And then he abandons you. That's the thing about Satan, man. Like, he will lead you so far down his path of pleasure, and he waits till you get to that part of total ruin, you know, and then boom, he abandons you. And what used to be your best friend, you know, like let's take drug addicts, for example, whom I hang around with, you know, I work through Urban Missionaries. You know, heroin was their idol. It was their thing. But if you do heroin long enough, you don't get high anymore, right? You don't. You just have to do it so you don't get dope sick. And that's how Satan basically was with me, man. And so by the 3rd robbery, I was done. Like, I was miserable. And when I was actually finally arrested, I was turned in by one of my criminal buddies, you know, because he got caught stealing engine hoists. So in order to, because, you know, we'd steal engines and cars. So he ended up turning me in. And honestly, it was one of the greatest blessings of my life to go to prison. And I was actually happy when I got arrested. And the intake officer at the jail thought I was crazy. He's like, what's wrong with this kid, man? This kid's like happy, and he just got arrested for robbing banks. But, you know, I threw myself on the mercy of the court. Ironically, they gave me the hanging judge up in Olympia because I was in Portland, robbing the banks in Washington, 2 in Olympia, 1 in Tacoma. This was back in 1992. And so they gave me the hanging judge. His name was Richard Strophe. And I had completely cooperated with the police from day one. I told them about a robbery they didn't even know about because, this witness said it was a light-skinned black man, right? But it, so much for witnesses. So, I just threw myself on the mercy of the court. And Richard Strophe, he listened, the judge listened to my testimony, so to speak, and was like, you know what? This is a stupid kid who's playing at being a bank robber, who's just, if anyone might make it, it's this kid. And so he gave me the minimum. First of all, the feds had mercy on me and gave me to the state because I would have gotten 15 years federal time. So the state charged me, first degree armed robbery, 2 second degree robberies, and I got 5 years. I only did 3 due to good time. So I was the luckiest 18-year-old in the world. And they told me, they said, if you went in there with a gun, you would be doing 15 years federal right now. So glory be to God. I mean, I had so many near misses, and my guardian angel was working overtime, to get me to where I need to be today. So, wow. So, oh, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to ask, when you were in prison for those 3 years, what was your relationship with God like over that time? I would imagine the time of some silence, some breaking away from the world. I mean, it's kind of like you're sent on a retreat of sorts, maybe not the kind of retreat most people would want to go on, but I would think that there'd be some sense of having to face God once more. Was there anything that took place in that relationship while you were in prison?
Yeah. I mean, basically the reason I wanted into prison, so to speak, was because I knew I needed to go away for a while and just figure out who I am, what's my place in the world, what's my future going to be like. I knew I had to rebuild myself, right? And so one of the first things I did when I got arrested is I actually, I walked down. We're about to hit a break, but I'll tell you really quick. I walked down to where the books were in the jail, and there were a bunch of Louis L'Amours and some Bibles, and I didn't want anyone to know I was reading the Bible. So I took a Louis L'Amour, put the little Bible on top of it, put another Louis L'Amour, and then snuck back up to the cell to read the Gospels.
We'll be back right after this break. More with Scott Woltze on Holy Ground with Scott today as he shares some of his personal testimony with us. And, you can hear how Scott has really reflected upon all of this, upon so much that has occurred in his life, so much that he did, that he didn't do, and that he has sorted through this. It seems like very clearly with the Lord our God. And so we're going to hear about that reconciliation when we get back and how the Lord has been using him in some very powerful ways since. Stay tuned.
This is Life News Radio. I'm Jim Anderson. 22 states' attorneys general want reversal of the Biden White House FDA rule turning pharmacies into abortion locations. They say abandoning common sense restrictions on remote prescriptions and administering abortion-inducing drugs is not only dangerous but illegal. These top law officials of 22 states say the FDA move violates the plain text of federal law, and they also promise enforcement of their states' laws. This Friday is the Washington, D.C. March for Life, marking both 50 years of abortion and the end of Roe. Leading the March for Life, Jeannie Mancini says pro-life advocates continue heroic work saving children from abortion. This is Life News Radio. A culture of life has a rarely mentioned but very formidable enemy. Pornography is material that deceives its consumers into thinking that they possess beauty, while the reality is they are possessed by a lie. The first step may be to talk openly with your pastor or confessor, reject the lie, and recognize that a culture of life relies upon you. Noted attorney and head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Ed Whalen, is taking apart Biden Justice Department arguments, claiming legal U.S. postal delivery of misoprostol. In short, yes, misoprostol is both a stomach treatment and an abortifacient drug. Whalen says the U.S. Code plainly says the abortifacient use bans all misoprostol from U.S. mail because of that one use. And new research shows the importance of the Abortion Survivors Protection Act now headed to the U.S. Senate. Factoring internationally established abortion survivor rates, the Abortion Survivors Network contends the U.S. has 1,700 abortion survivors annually. For pro-life headlines delivered to your email address daily, sign up at lifenews.com. This has been Life News Radio.
Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today on this Testimony Tuesday, Scott Woltze. He is founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ, Catholics who bring the presence of Jesus to the streets, with chapters in Portland, Oregon, Louisville, Kentucky, and the Philippines. You can learn more by going to urbanapostolate.blogspot.com. And Scott has quite a story that he's been sharing with us so far today on the first half of the show. Now we begin the second half, and we're going to lead up into the good news of what the good Lord has done in Scott's life. Really after this, what seems to be, I think, the rock bottom experience of Scott ending up in prison for 3 years for robbing 3 banks at the age of 18. And that's where we left off. So Scott, tell us some more about what was going on there with you and God in prison and then going forward.
Okay. So, reading the Gospels up in my cell, it really did not seem like any other book. The words were like alive. The person of Jesus was really just seemed so compelling, right? And so I really drank it in, and I took it seriously. And I was smart enough to realize that to be a follower of Jesus meant, to be a life of forgiveness, a life of charity, patience, understanding, things like that. But I wasn't smart enough to understand how I could live that in a maximum security prison, because that's where I ended up getting sent. And the prison I was at was called Column Bay up in northern Washington. They called it a gladiator school among the inmates, because they basically put all like the crazy young guys, the gangbangers, and then like the more old school cons, like the bikers, the gypsy jokers, cocaine dealers, people like that there. And so I remember, talking to Jesus about this. I'm just like, God, how am I going to do this, man? I mean, I'm 18. I mean, yeah, I can fight. I'd boxed for a while to toughen myself up before I went to prison. And I'd lifted weights since I was 15. So, I wasn't a normal 18-year-old, but still, these were grown men, right? It's the difference between 18-year-old strength and 28-year-old strength. So, I'm nervous, man. And so I was walking around the big yard one day in the prison, and I was talking to Jesus, and it's like my fists were clenched, and I was just telling Jesus, I'm like, I can't do it. Like, I know you're real. I know God's real, but I can't live this way in prison. And so I walked away, and I became deep in convict society. The more experienced cons watched me to see what kind of guy I was. Was I a crazy young guy flying off at the handle, disrespecting others, or was I cool and calculating and smart and whatnot? And they figured out I was tough, and kind of went through all the little tests. They send you through the inmates kind of to check you to see who you are, what you're about, And so I ended up running around, with the worst crowd, really, the guys who were bringing in all the dope into the prison and stuff like that. And I mean, everyone was a racist back then in prison. That was rough. That's embarrassing looking back on it. I mean, it was just old school convict culture. I think that's a thing that's fading away in America, which is a good thing. But, I lapped it up. There were some good things. It taught me respect for people, like you wouldn't, you had to keep your temper in prison. You weren't ripping other people off, things like that. So I did learn like honesty, respect for persons. And I really did grow into a sense of myself, a sense of manhood in prison. So there were some good things there. I really did kind of create a moral center in prison, as crazy as that sounds. Like if someone would do something wrong in prison, like my heart would like burn at the injustice, which is kind of absurd, right? But so my life in prison was basically split. I spent half the time as a convict playing cards and, harassing child molesters and snitches as those old school convicts types do. And then I spent the other half of the time reading books, especially the classics of Western civilization, mostly philosophy and literature. And they were basically the secular classics, and I fell in love with them. And so, I'd go to the service, the Catholic service occasionally at the prison, and there was no beauty there. And there's no beauty in prison. And it would have been so nice if the priest had a beautiful vestment, and maybe we did some Gregorian chant or even some music that was good. I don't want to be snarky, but I needed some beauty in my mass, and even just if he would have just spoke heart to heart with us, but man, I just never found that priest, In fact, when I was in minimum security, I went to the priest and I said, hey, I have this love of philosophy, and I've heard that John Paul II is this great philosopher, and I'm interested in reading some of his encyclicals. I've heard Veritatis Splendor is really good. I'd like to read it. And man, the priest looked at me like I just passed gas. He's like, what? Why would you want to read that? And I mean, there's grace in these moments, because the way I view it now is God wants you, as St. Paul says, to be all things to all men, so that some may be saved. So when I do urban missionaries out on the street, when someone tells me they're into the new age, I don't just blow up my eyebrows and be like, oh my God, because I've lost them. Conversation's over. They're not going to listen to me, So you have to, you have to be sensitive to where other people are coming from, what they want, what they find interesting. And so I wish that priest would have said, even if he didn't like, Veritatis Splendor or John Paul II or what, I wish he would have just been like, oh, that's amazing. You're a 20-year-old inmate who wants to read papal encyclicals. Okay, I'll do it with you, and we can send letters back and forth. That would have been amazing, but that didn't happen. Okay, so I get out of prison, and I just started marching through academia because, again, I loved the books of I loved the Western canon, and I wanted to be a professor who thought and wrote about these things for my life. So I had to go to Portland Community College for a couple of years just to get my academic skills up to muster. Then I went to a small liberal arts college in Portland called Reed College, which is like a breeding ground for future professors. It's a very good school. Like Steve Jobs from Apple Computers went there. It's a very good school. I got an excellent education. And then I was, I put in a bunch of doctoral program applications, and I got a full ride at the University of Michigan in political and moral philosophy, studying in the political science department. So at this point, I look amazing on paper, right? I mean, very quickly, I've gone from someone in prison, reading these very difficult books in his cell, taking copious notes, right? I still to this day have a stack of notes this high that I took in prison. So I went from that to PCC to liberal arts college, to now I'm working on my doctorate. But here's the thing. I was getting deeper and deeper and deeper in mortal sin. And so at this point, like when I got out of prison, I was just girl crazy. Before I went to prison, I had a kind of reverence for women. I think it's a grace from my Catholic upbringing, respect for my mom and my female relatives. And so, even though I dated a lot in high school, I always had limits. I felt like if we went too far, if you know what I mean, that it would tarnish her, tarnish me, and tarnish what we had together. And so even though everyone thought I was this, notorious womanizer in high school, I wasn't at all, actually. But when I got out of prison, I was. And again, I mean, sin, you just, the more mortal sins you accumulate, the further you go down that road with the devil, the more demons hook on with you and travel with you. You know what I mean? And so I'll explain that in more detail in a little bit. But so the bottom line was I was miserable. So many people in modern society today carry with them so much anxiety. They have to battle depression. And, I fell into an incredibly deep depression. And I can say there was only one cause of that depression, and it was my mortal sin. it was the way I treated people. It was my alienation from God. And I know some people have like clinical depression, and that's different. But so many of the mental health problems, again, we're not talking about schizophrenia or bipolar, but other ones that are more common. So much of them have to do with being in mortal sin, and that's where I was, and I was deep in it. So I somehow survived this depression, and one time I went to confession in the midst of it because I was just desperate, and this 80-year-old priest, he was old, and he received me, and I told him, I said, Father, I'm having suicidal thoughts. I am so depressed. I can barely hang on. I don't want to kill myself. I was just like, please pray for me. God bless that priest. He jumped out of the confessional, he's just like, anything but. I love that guy. He, I'm sure he prayed for me, dedicated all of his physical infirmities and stuff. And I'm sure he offered that up for me. He was a good man. So, anyway, so one day, here comes the conversion part. So one day I'm mowing my lawn, I believe it was April 13th, 2007. And I just turned in my grades because I had taught at University of Michigan for 3 years now at this point as a doctoral student. And I'd received my candidacy. I'd passed all my qualifying exams. And I was kicking myself while I was mowing my lawn because I treated this young lady bad. I won't go into it because it'll take too much time. But, I'd known at that point that romance and sex wouldn't make me happy. So I was like, why are you telling that nice born-again virgin girl that you're not going to date her unless, well, now I'm giving you the details. But so I was really mad at myself. I'm like, aren't you ever going to learn? Seriously, right? And this is what people in our culture do now. It's like they want out of what their current life is, right? But they don't know how to get out. They don't know where the escape ladder is to get out of their cycle of sins. And so, excuse the metaphor, but I was like a guy who was going around a toilet bowl, and I think a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and teen years are like that now. It's like they're going around, they don't want to, they want out of there, they don't know how to get out. And it never occurred to me that Christianity was the way to go. So I'm mowing my lawn, and all of a sudden, God intervenes, right? And it's like everything stopped, It's like time stopped. And I know that time didn't literally stop, that my neighbors, if they'd been looking out the window, would just see me standing there with the lawnmower running, for 5 seconds or something. But it's like God stopped time and focused all attention, sort of blocking out all of my other sensations. And I heard this voice say, I love you and I forgive you. And then this, it's like the Holy Spirit exploded, this divine love. I guess, I don't know what happened. If the Holy Spirit touched me, entered me, who knows? And this love just gently erupted, it was like a very tender explosion, just went, and, went down to my fingers and down to my toes. I could literally feel it spreading, And boy, God won me. That was it, man. All I had done for years is chase adrenaline and pleasure and whatnot, and God had just given me the most mind-blowing sensation. And it sounds to sort of desacralize it to talk about it like that, but if you feel the love of God, you have no interest in all this other stuff, You don't care about nice cars or anything. You're just like, whoa, where's God? I got to find him. He's where it's at. So, there's also that line from I think it's the Song of Songs, where it's like, you seduced me, Lord, and I was seduced, right? Well, I was completely seduced. I was, man, all I thought about for the next 3 days, Spirit kind of remained in me. The love of God slowly drained out of me for the next 3 days. And all I thought about was the experience, and I just used my the education I'd received to kind of think it through and be like, okay, who's this God? And I knew he was a monotheistic God, right? But it was gonna take a little more data from God to get me into Christianity.
All right, we're going to be right back with Scott Woltze, founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ. Very blessed to have him with us today. One more segment to go, and if you're looking for that escape hatch from a a dark life that Scott was describing there. He's, by his very testimony, sharing with you how he found it. And the answer is, it is Jesus, right? And this is not the Ned Flanders caricature, this weak sense of what it means to be one who has faith in Jesus. He is real. And it is the strength of one who will die for one that he loves, die for you, even one who maybe is far from him. Jesus loves you. He is risen. He is for you. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned.
This is Jesuit Father Robert McTagg, your dearly host of the Catholic Current. Join me on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern to meet attorney Rebecca Kiesling. We'll be talking about being pro-life without apologies, even in the so-called hard cases. Find out how true compassion really is pro-life. Join us on the Catholic Current on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Keep up to date with the shows we bring you each day on the Station of the Cross by viewing our programming grid on our website, thestationofthecross.com, and on our iCatholic Radio app. Just click the menu icon in the top left portion of our app and select the link to our programming grid. That's at thestationofthecross.com and on our free iCatholic Radio app for Android and Apple mobile devices.
Do you love listening to the Station of the Cross on your car radio, but sometimes find yourself driving outside the listening area? Never miss another minute of your favorite show. Download the iCatholic Radio app so you can listen anywhere in the world 24 hours a day. The iCatholic Radio app is available for your phone in the Apple Store or for your Android phone in Google Play. Visit thestationofthecross.com for more information.
30 seconds on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, brought to you by the Station of the Cross. The gift of knowledge allows us to see circumstances of our lives from a supernatural perspective. It can be difficult to explain to others how this gift is at work, but it greatly aids us in understanding the truths of the faith and the order of the universe as designed by God. The gift of knowledge also helps us in learning what God has revealed to us through nature and His Church.
Simple Truth. Jim Havens here. Testimony Tuesday. Our guest, Scott Woltze, founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ, Catholics who bring the presence of Jesus to the streets, with chapters in Portland, Oregon, Louisville, Kentucky, and the Philippines. urbanapostolate.blogspot.com. urbanapostolate.blogspot.com. Final segment, Scott, the floor is yours, but I do want to ask, as you were mentioning in the last segment at the end, how you did have this sense that there was one God. You encountered him, it seems like, as Jesus, as the Holy Spirit. You encountered him there. What about the Father? What about God the Father? Was there any sense of, I guess, bringing it back to full circle? You talked about the abusive father early on in the cycle of broken fatherhood that he came from. Anything you want to share about God the Father that would be part of the story here?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I think I kind of dodged God the Father after my conversion for the exact reasons you indicate. But Jesus is the divine physician, right? And so, like, when I had that experience of God's love, it's like God put two pieces of knowledge into my mind. One was simply that he was taking the chip off my shoulder that ex-convicts typically have. And then the second one was that he was going to restore me to the little boy that I'd been before all this happened. That little boy, that little 7-year-old back in San Luis Obispo. So, and so, that's the beauty of our religion, is that God, if you let him into your heart, he does heal you. And so, my dad and I, we did have a good relationship. Especially, it just got better and better every year at this point. And he even did Urban Missionaries with me as he came out once, from his hometown in Tucson. And, glory be to God. And then, another piece of healing, I needed healing about the church, right? So I was resentful of the kind of masses that I'd experienced as a child. Because like I said, I was hurting. I needed help. I needed God's beauty and mystery and transcendence. I just needed that sense that there was this God out here. And so like when I came back to the church, like for me, it was like Latin Mass or nothing, right? And that was even before Pope Benedict had liberated that Mass. And I was familiar with it beforehand. I won't go into that, how I was familiar, because we don't have time. But you know what? God has healed that too. God has healed those sort of resentments. I know there are older people who resent the Mass they grew up with in the 50s and 60s, the old traditional Latin Mass, and they need to let Jesus heal that and just move on. And similarly with myself, people who resent, they feel like they weren't adequately served with beauty or truth as a child. You have to let Jesus in there and clean that up. So yeah, I would say that God the Father is the most inscrutable one for me. My favorite saint is Charles de Foucauld, otherwise known as Brother Charles of Jesus. So I'm a Jesus kind of guy with the little Holy Spirit sprinkled in. I think, so I would be terrible. I would be terrible if someone asked me to give a reflection on God the Father. Though my relationship with my dad before he passed, I would call it excellent. Okay, so after this happens, I did have a experience with demons. I'll try to be quick about it. So, I knew that there was a monotheistic God out there, right? But it never occurred to me there'd be something like evil spirits. I mean, that just seemed insane. As my years in academia, it never even occurs to you that there's something like demons, right? And I was studying like causes and consequences of war and stuff, and the idea of evil spirits flaming these ethnic tensions and things like that never occurred to me. But, one day, after the Holy Spirit kind of drained out of me on the third day, I was going running at Mayberry Park in Michigan with my dogs. We'd run late at night, but no one else was around. And these, right when the divine love faded, these voices were like I could feel voices like putting thoughts in my mind, and it was very obvious it was coming from just outside of me, and they were extremely wicked thoughts. And what was going on here was the demons were so mad being kicked out of my life, because like I said, I'd invited them in through all the things I'd done. They were so mad that they were just desperate to get back in, and they were just throwing the most insane temptations at me, though they weren't moving me at all. I was just sort of registering him in my mind. So I said to God, I'm like, are there demons? There must be demons. So I started running and talking to God the whole way. And then at one point, I emerged out of the woods into this kind of like asphalt service road. And God showed me, just for about 3 or 4 seconds, this like horde of demons. There was, hundreds of them, maybe almost 1,000, who were sort of like trying to come at me. And honestly, that was the greatest shock of my life, far more than that God would, sort of reach down and, say he loved me and he forgave me and that he forgave me. And so, when I saw those demons, I knew that, Christianity, Islam, or Judaism must be true, because they're all monotheistic religions that actually believe in evil spirits. And it didn't take me long to figure out that Jesus, that Jesus was the way to go, that the Gospels were true. All I had to do was read them, and they completely matched up just with the sense of that God who had only said a few words to me, I love you and I forgive you, but he gave me a sense of who he was. And so I quickly made myself back into the Catholic Church. And then, I threw myself into the good things you do, late night adoration, daily Mass. I did a lot of heavy lifting with St. Vincent de Paul for about 10 years. I did 40 Days for Life for 3 years. And then God called me to do street outreach. And I thought what he was calling me to do was to walk around very secular Portland, and I'd kind of show off my super education and, educate educate the hipsters, progressives, the people on the street, the secularists of Portland, teach them a thing or two, but that's not what God was calling me to at all, because I noticed after about a year of walking the streets, that the only people I was talking to were prostitutes and drug addicts and hobos and stuff. And, God put a love of them into my heart. And as I understood them and began to hear their stories, I realized that they were just like me, except their childhood was 10 million times worse. Like, they endured stuff that I couldn't even imagine enduring, and they were barely holding it together. I mean, so often I can't even believe they're still alive, that they're hanging in there like that, given the things they've suffered. And so God gave me a love for them. And it's funny because God, he really did trick me into the ministry, because, after I got out of prison, as the years progressed, I was like, I don't want people to even be able to tell I was in prison. And I would dress really nice, and all the rich kids at Reed College would slum. They'd dress in hand-me-down clothes, or they go to the thrift store and shop, so they didn't look like rich kids. And I'm this convict, dressed in a suit. I'd wear really fancy clothes. It's so funny. So I had this self-image of myself, and that I was a success and blah blah blah, and I'm not going to go near those drug dealers and drug addicts and prostitutes. But God knew that. And so he had to kind of trick me out onto the streets, But, glory be to God. He better than I knew myself, So it's been amazing ever since. A lot of young Catholics do it with us. And so many friends on the streets I've met over the years, especially ex-convicts.
Yeah, what a testimony. We're gonna have to, by God's grace, have Scott back on again to share more with us. There's certainly more to this story. It'd be great to hear some tales from the mission field, what we can learn, some practical lessons as well, how we can be missionaries in our own lives wherever we're at. But thank you so much, Scott Woltze, for being with us today. Again, founder of the Urban Missionaries of the Heart of Christ. You can learn more by going to urbanapostolate.blogspot.com, urbanapostolate.blogspot.com. Thank you again, Scott, and God bless you all.
My name is Nathan Wigfield, Executive Director of the St. Thomas More House of Prayer, a Catholic retreat center in Cranberry, Pennsylvania.